All right, so last type of problem we can do with geometric series is if instead of starting with the series, we start with something like this, start with the formula, we can try and create the series that goes with it. And so I would recognize this and say, oh, this looks sort of like my general formula for the sum of the geometric series. The 5 is not right? I can't have a 5 on top, so I'd sort of factor the 5 out. And then this 9x squared down on the bottom, that becomes my multiplier. And so I have the 5 out in front, and then I start with a 1, and then my 9x squared is the multiplier. So I'm going to have 9x squared, and then I'm going to multiply by 9x squared. And so notice how that's in parentheses, right? And so I'm squaring that whole thing. And then I'd have 9x squared, and I'd cube that. And then I'd have 9x squared to the 4th, and so on, right? And then from there, I could sort of clean it up. I could multiply the 5 in, right? So I'd have 5 times that, and then 5 times that squared, and so on. And depending on what you were doing with this, whoops, this is all 9x squared, you could sort of get rid of those inner parentheses and so on. If you wanted to write it with sigma notation, what's my sigma notation? I have my 5 that's just sort of sitting there, and then I'm multiplying by 9x squared to a power. What's the power starting at? Starting at 0. Just make sure it works. When you plug in 0, this would become 1 times 5 is 5. I'm just going to keep going. When I plug 1 in, that would give me, sure enough, this next term. When I plug in 2, I'm only squaring the 9x squared. And so it all checks out. And so this is equal to this series, which is equal to this fraction that I started with. And of course, they're equal only if it converges, which means only if that multiplier is less than 1. And so if I clean that up, divide by 9, and then take the square root, right? The x value that the x values that these work for will be between 1/3 and -1/3. And so once you have this sort of building block, this thing that's we're memorizing from the first video, right? Once we know that these two things are equal, this infinite series is equal to 1/1 minus x. When x is between 1 and -1, we can use that to build new things, new conclusions. And in fact, as we'll see later on down the road, we can even do some calculus to this series and to this left-hand side to get even more relationships. All right, that's it for part 2.